So let's start this webinar and welcome everybody to this webinar on open innovation in science, as part of which we will be discussing the role and the value of open and collaborative practices in scientific research. Briefly about myself, I'm Benedikt Salmen. I'm the scientific coordinator of the Medical Neurosciences International Graduate Program at the Charité, and also educational coordinator at the Einstein Center for Neurosciences in Berlin. Throughout this webinar, you can post your questions, please only using the chat function. We are going to address them then a bit later at the end of the seminar in the Q&A session. Please address your questions exclusively to me, that means to Benedikt. At the Einstein Center for Neurosciences, we firmly believe that developing novel and impactful scientific benefits from engaging in intra- and transdisciplinary knowledge flows and collaborations. Already since 2017, we have therefore systematically been empowering ECN researchers to learn about and experiment with open and collaborative research practices. So, among other things, we have implemented the Lab for Open Innovation in Science, a particular training program for junior researchers and their PIs, as part of which they learn how to improve the productivity and social impact of their own research by applying open and collaborative research methods. Related to this program, we have also launched the ECN Open Innovation in Science Award, a prize that supports researchers and research teams to productively implement their open innovation in science ideas in their own research projects. Approaches benefit the research projects. If you want to learn more about the ECN Open Innovation in Science Award, there is a separate webinar on this tomorrow. So, as for today, we have invited Professor Marion Pötz from the Copenhagen Business School, who has been helping with setting up and running the ECN Open Innovation in Science initiative since its very beginning. Marion is also the scientific director of the Open Innovation in Science Center in Austria, and as such, the head of a pioneer institution in the field of open innovation in science. So Marion, many thanks for joining us today. I personally attended the 2016 edition of one of your labs for open innovation in science myself. And by doing so, it became clear to me that applying open and collaborative practices to science is more than open access, publishing, or just technology transfer. Could you please explain what open innovation in science is and how does it relate to or is even different from open science or open innovation?
Sure. Thank you very much, Benedikt, and a warm welcome from my side as well. So on your question, Benedikt, what is open innovation in science and how does it relate to, or how is it different from concepts such as open science and open innovation? Allow me to draw on well-established definitions of those concepts. Let's start by looking into open science. And here I draw on a definition from Foster Open Science, a renowned European organization advocating for and educating on open science. And they do define open science as, and I'm reading this now from their original definition, as the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate and contribute, where research data, lab notes, and other research processes are freely available under terms that enable reuse, redistribution, and reproduction of the research and its underlying data and methods. So essentially, the core of the open science idea is that open science is about making research findings accessible to all rather than keeping them locked away behind a paywall. So the focus of the open science movement, and that's a very important one, is basically on sharing intermediary and final outcomes of scientific research for the purpose of being reused, for the purpose of being accessed by various actors from within and across academia to enable, as it says in the definition, reuse, redistribution, and reproduction of research. So the focus here is on the scientific research institution to open up, to share knowledge, to share intermediary and final research insights, and of course as well on the scientific researchers. But what this model does not embrace is to think about how scientific researchers and how scientific research institutions themselves can make use of knowledge, external knowledge and external resources in order to improve the quality of their research. This is, however, something that the open innovation idea embraces. Open innovation is a concept that, compared to open science, focuses on companies, innovating companies, and employees in innovating companies for the purpose of developing innovation. So here we see this process, the process focus of looking into how organizations can not only rely on their internal knowledge sources and resources for the purpose of generating new products, services, business models, or new processes, but how they can use multiple external sources, such as users, patents, competitor knowledge, external agency, or the general public to drive innovation. In open innovation, there are two specific types of open innovation. Inbound open innovation, where a company learns from external knowledge sources about new ideas, new solutions to problems that they then translate into new products or services for the market. And outbound open innovation, where a company shares, freely shares or sells knowledge to the outside world in order to generate innovation. So what we can see here is the open innovation concept has a process perspective, considers how an innovating organization can use knowledge and resources from the external world in order to generate innovation. But its focus is on companies and not on the scientific research institution. And the open science concept focuses on scientific research and scientific research institutions, but it primarily has a focus on unidirectional knowledge flows, about sharing, about making data, about making research findings accessible to the outside world, freely accessible to the outside world. The concept of open innovation science, and here I come to your question, Benedict, is basically drawing from both of these concepts and providing an umbrella concept to think about the role and value of openness and respectively transdisciplinary collaborations across the entire scientific research process. So the scientific research organization and scientific researchers are in the focus when we talk about open innovation in science, but compared to the open science concept, which primarily focuses on outbound knowledge flows with respect to freely sharing knowledge, methods, data, algorithms, and research findings, the open innovation in science concept embraces how scientific researchers and research institutions can learn from the outside world, so can access and leverage knowledge from within and across academia in order to develop scientific research that is impactful with respect to scientific and societal impact. I'm getting back to that a little later in more detail, but let's look into an example that will help us understand, probably better understand, open innovation in science. This is a picture from last year's Open Innovation Science Award, and you may see that Benedict is on that picture. I'm on that picture too. But most importantly, on this picture, there is two young researchers whose project was among the two winning projects of the 2022 Open Innovation Science Award. And these two researchers work on digital psychiatry. They are part of a larger research team at the Department of Psychiatry and Neurosciences at Charité. And they are primarily interested in better understanding how digital health interventions can help address more complex deep mental illnesses such as bipolar disorder. And in this specific research project that they used an open innovation science approach, they aimed for developing a digital health intervention for people with bipolar disorder. And they did that in a co-research process together with relevant stakeholder groups. So why that? Bipolar disease is a complex mental illness and better understanding what are unmet patient needs, what are digital preferences of people who are affected by bipolar disorder is a quite complicated thing, because bipolar disorder, we're talking about a sensitive and stigmatized issue here, where it's very difficult to get high quality data and better understand what are the needs of these patients, what are their digital preferences. So in order to avoid biases on the one hand side and on the other hand side, to get high quality data on unmet needs and digital preferences of patients, these researchers decided to co-develop the data collection instrument with the patients and with peer specialists in order to increase the quality and also the accuracy of the data they collect. Then they moved on to say, well, if we have all that data about needs and digital preferences of patients, we also need to make sure that we avoid biases in analyzing the data and interpreting the findings. So they have also set up, or they plan, this is a very new project that is ongoing, they plan to also co-analyze the data that has been collected together with patients and peer specialists, and use the outcome of that process to co-develop a digital therapy tool with patients, with peer specialists, and of course also with various other stakeholders such as software and app developers. So this is a really nice open innovation in science example, where the scientists themselves, in this case, scientists who work on digital psychiatry, use knowledge, in this case, from patients and peer specialists and software and app developers in order to engage them as co-researchers in developing a digital health intervention for people with bipolar disorder. Doing so is expected to improve the productivity and the impact of that research by getting better data, by avoiding biases, and by eventually, of course, also translating the outcome, collaboratively translating the outcome of this process into a digital health application. So let's move on with some more general aspects in answering Benedict's question on what open innovation science is. And here I'd like to focus on two key aspects for understanding the role and value of open innovation science. The first one relates to the fact that in open innovation science, openness and collaboration are seen as a means to increase the productivity and impact of scientific research, and not as an end in itself. So just being open does not help you in doing better research and translating your research in a better way into innovation. It needs to be seen as a tool, as a means to help you achieve your goals with respect to productivity, but of course also with respect to societal impact. Related to this, it's also important to take into account that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Different scientific disciplines and different types of research, for example, basic versus applied research, may require different approaches of openness and collaboration in order to benefit the productivity and the societal impact. So that's the first issue. I'm going to bring some examples in a few minutes. The second issue that is important when talking about open innovation science is, as I already mentioned before, it's not only about openly sharing data and algorithms and findings and open access publishing. It's also about accessing and leveraging knowledge from the outside world, from researchers in other disciplines, from even outside academia. In the example I just mentioned before, it was learning from patients and peer specialists in order to improve the kind of research that you're working on. So the focus on open innovation science is on outbound and inbound knowledge flows and respectively transdisciplinary collaborations. And not only at specific stages of the research process. When we talk about open access publishing, then it's about sharing the final results of a research paper, but open innovation science also thinks about using open and collaborative approaches along the entire process of scientific research. from generating research questions to publishing your results, and eventually maybe even to translating your results into new therapies, into new drugs, into new digital tools. So let's look into this idea that openness and collaborations are a means to increasing the productivity and impact of scientific research. Here, we distinguish between the productivity view and the democratization view. So the literature on openness and collaboration science thinks about how can open and collaborative approaches help you to improve the scientific output and the scientific impact on the one hand side, and how can open and collaborative approaches help you to empower, educate, to build awareness, and maybe even advocacy in society or among different groups of societal actors, such as patients or medical professionals in your field. In open innovation science, the productivity view is essential, but of course, empowerment and education, raising awareness and advocacy comes along by means of engaging various kinds of stakeholders in the scientific research process. And when we think about openness and collaboration science as a means to improve the productivity of scientific research, this very much relates to discussions that openness and collaboration could be a remedy to addressing declining scientific productivity and helping us better to tackle the grand challenges of our times. There's quite a lot of research out there that informs us that not everything is working perfectly in the way we do scientific research. We see all kinds of indicators for a declining scientific productivity. Here I cite an article by Chu and Evans that has recently been published in PNAS that shows that in many different fields of scientific research, we see a trend towards incrementalism in science. So more and more smaller contributions rather than breakthroughs, rather than high risk, potential high gain research projects. We also see a novelty bias in research, that more novel research is less likely to receive funding. I guess you all know about the publication bias, that it's more likely that you will be able to publish positive results. There's a lot of issues around not replicable, on false or even fraudulent research. We also have data that shows us that quite a lot of research papers have low or even no impact. A lot of research papers in different disciplines have no or even or only few citations. I guess those of you who are working more in applied research will be very aware of the translational gap, so that quite a lot of the fantastic research never gets translated into innovation, new products, new processes, new treatments, new drugs, and so on and so forth. And we also have data that shows us that it's particularly patents that were issued by university researchers that are never licensed. Company patents are more likely to be licensed as compared to university patents. And then, of course, the limits of the peer review system, I guess that is something we're all aware of, and this idea of publish or perish. On the other hand side, there is an increasing demand to increase not only the scientific impact of scientific research in terms of high quality publications in highly ranked journals, but also the societal impact of scientific research, particularly with respect to complex and grand challenges of our times, such as addressing cancer or curing cancer or addressing the climate crisis. And this is also why there is an increasing policy attention to open science and open innovation, including new funding schemes and requirements. I'm not aware who of you has already tried to submit a research proposal or co-submit a research proposal to the New Horizon Europe funding system or funding scheme. But in Horizon Europe, if you have a closer look, you will see that the Horizon Europe funding program explicitly talks about mandatory and recommended open science practices, and how well a research proposal can demonstrate that they apply these open science practices is considered in the evaluation of the research proposal under excellence and quality and efficiency of implementation. On the list of mandatory open science practices, we see the usual suspects, such as open access, publication to scientific outcome, and applying the FAIR principles with respect to data management. FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. There's a couple of other things, but let me move to the right-hand side here, the list of recommended open science practices. And here, the Horizon Europe funding program explicitly talks about research projects involving all relevant knowledge actors, including citizens. It also talks about applying citizen science, involving citizens, civil society, and end users in the co-creation of research and innovation agendas, contents, and so on. There's a couple of other things. This is a non-exhaustive list, and we also see that specific work programs under Horizon Europe or specific calls may recommend specific additional open innovation in science practices. And I brought an example here from a call that was issued in 2021, and where the submission deadline was spring 2022. This was a call for developing new methods and technologies for cancer screening and early cancer detection. And in this specific call, the proposal was required to address a number of things. And among those things, the proposal should consider the use of, and this is original from the call, the use of living labs or other implementation research models that use open knowledge and social innovation systems and support end user engagement. So just to give you an example, that funding schemes, or that the ecosystem in a sense is changing, and also funding schemes require researchers, or increasingly require researchers, to be able to demonstrate mastering the integration of open and collaborative practices into their research projects. Here is another example that I find really interesting. An example from Denmark, from Aarhus University in Denmark, funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation. This is an interesting open innovation in science platform, as part of which the Novo Nordisk Foundation provided more than 50 million Danish krone to develop and implement a new model of open or collaborative co-creation of basic research projects related to biomarkers and target validation among researchers from Aarhus University and actors from various companies in the pharma industry with respect to artificial intelligence and other digital tools. And in this model, in this ODIN model, the idea is that scientific researchers, together with actors from different kinds of companies, co-create novel research ideas and proposals. The best proposals will receive funding from the Novo Nordisk Foundation in order to be implemented, and also this implementation of the research is done in a collaborative process among the researchers and actors from industry and other stakeholder groups. Additionally, all these projects are required to openly share all their outcomes for the purpose of, on the one hand side, facilitating novel high-risk, high-gain research. And we're talking about basic research here, technology readiness level 1 to 3, and to increase the likelihood of translation, so that even if the research group that works on this research project does not decide to further pursue the outcome, by means of openly sharing all the outcomes, other actors, other researchers, clinical researchers, for example, or companies may decide to translate the outcome into more applied research projects, clinical studies, for examples, and eventually new kinds of drugs to address various kinds of diseases. So let's move on to the second aspect that I wanted to discuss, related to seeing openness and collaboration in science as a means and not an ends. There is no one size fits all. So different disciplines in scientific research and different types of research may require different approaches. And this is an absolutely non-exhaustive list of different kinds of research areas and different types of open and collaborative research projects that we have seen in these areas. For example, in research on COVID-19, we've seen lots of open data reuse, lots of inter and transdisciplinary collaborations. In basic research fields such as quantum physics, molecular biology, or neuroscience, we've seen a number of very successful crowd or citizen science approaches. In climate research, in clinical research, we've seen successful projects that engage, for example, patients as co-researchers, co-research, co-creation approaches, community-based research approaches. Particularly in the medical research fields, we've also seen approaches that I've just shown you in this Odin model, new forms of pre-competitive open research collaborations between science and industry. In other research areas, such as history or literature and arts, we've seen successful contributory crowd science projects or open data reuse approaches. Or in physics, genomics, and other research areas, we've seen that big science information infrastructures and interdisciplinary collaborations are extremely valuable in order to improve the productivity and impact of scientific research. And if I may show you one example from that list that I find really, really interesting, and that I hope that is also interesting to you, that is the Epidemium platform. Epidemium is basically an open innovation science ecosystem that enables a collaborative approach to cancer research through big data and analytics. So Epidemium hosts and enables the interaction between cancer researchers, medical doctors, data scientists, patients, graphic designers, and sociologists to, on the one hand side, develop novel research projects and then to co-implement these collaboratively developed research projects that all leverage the potential of big data for improving cancer research outcomes. And I've included the links to all these projects on the slide, so you can follow up on that. But the main objective of Epidemium is to support cancer research by producing scientific knowledge. And there is also, of course, a review process, both based by an ethics committee and a scientific committee. And the best projects that are developed in this open and collaborative way will be rewarded with publication support in medical journals. Let's move on to the fact that we have different types of research. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pasteur's quadrant, developed by Stokes in 1997. This is an idea of classifying research into pure basic research, where we have a quest for fundamental understanding and no consideration of use. For pure applied research, where we do have considerations of use, but no quest for fundamental understanding, and what is called use-inspired basic research, where we have both. We have a quest for fundamental understanding, and we also have considerations of use, which is why it's called Pasteur's quadrant, because Louis Pasteur had a quest for fundamentally understanding the role of bacteria, but he also considered considerations of use. Why does milk get sour, and what can we do about that? And if we look into these different types of research approaches, let's start with pure basic research. And here is an example how open innovation science helped pure basic research. iWire is a project that I guess you or many neuroscientists will know about. It's a large-scale crowd science project using 3D puzzle games and artificial intelligence to crowdsource neuron reconstruction. It was founded by scientists at Princeton University, and it addresses the issue that it's very time-consuming even for neuroscientists to reconstruct even a single cell. So there's a lot of effort that is needed to reconstruct cells. And that's why they applied or developed this crowd science approach using 3D puzzle games. So it's a gamified crowd science approach in artificial intelligence to empower anyone to help map the human brain. And so far, the EyeWire approach has already developed several new circuits and types of neurons, and of course, by doing so, contributing to basically to understanding basics of the human brain. If we look into a project that is more in the category of use-inspired basic research, the Odin approach that I already mentioned before is an interesting open innovation in science example. The Odin Open Innovation Science platform facilitates the development of use-inspired basic research projects in biomarkers and target validation. Use-inspired because by means of collaborations between scientists and companies and other stakeholder groups, such as patients, relevant needs and problems in the context of certain diseases are used as an inspiration to co-create basic research projects. And on this slide, you just see a selection of 5 Odin research projects that were co-created in this way and that received funding for being implemented from the Novo Nordisk Foundation. And finally, if we look into pure applied research, here's another example that nicely shows how open and collaborative approaches can be used for applied research. This project is called RADA CNS. It's a collaborative research project involving universities, companies, and patient organizations to explore the potential of wearable devices to help measure and predict clinical outcomes in depression, multiple sclerosis, and epilepsy. And this is a project that was funded by the EU's Innovative Medicines Initiative. This is a private collective funding platform that particularly funds larger scale health research projects that are set up and implemented in a collaborative fashion among universities, companies, and patient organizations. And speaking of IMI-funded research, here's a nice set of data that was published by the EU's Innovative Medicine Initiative, showing the value of engaging in open innovation science. This was published in 2021, and it looks into the impact of research projects that were generated in these collaborative IMI approaches. And this report finds that the publications from IMI projects are cited at twice the global average. This is kind of interesting because many researchers might potentially consider, well, engaging in collaborations with companies or patients is, of course, time-consuming, but at least according to this statistic, it seems to pay off. So let's close up with looking into this idea that open innovation sciences focuses on bidirectional knowledge flows and collaborations along the entire process of scientific research. Going back again to the open innovation science model as a unifying foundation for understanding processes, effects, and boundary conditions of openness and inter-transdisciplinary knowledge flows and collaborations along the scientific research process. Allow me to use the example of crowd and citizen science approaches as one out of many open innovation science tools as a means to show you how crowd and citizen science approaches can be used productively along different stages of the scientific research process, from developing a research idea and a research question to writing up a paper and diffusing the research results. Let's start out by a project, an open innovation science project that was implemented by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Experimental and Clinical Traumatology in Austria. In this open innovation science project, the research institute was well aware that they're very productive in their research, they are well established in their field, but they learned or they realized that much of their research is a bench to bedside approach. So their research might lack relevance with respect to addressing actual societal problems or needs. So this is why they wanted to reverse or turn the bench to bedside approach into a bedside to bench approach. And by means of a crowdsourcing process, a large-scale crowdsourcing process, and you can see pictures of the crowdsourcing campaign on this slide, they invited patients, their caretakers, and medical professionals, for example, trauma surgeons or nurses, to submit research questions, to tell them what research questions about accidental injuries should research in traumatology address. And as part of this crowdsourcing process, more than 800 research questions were submitted by patients, caretakers, medical professionals. All these questions were screened, evaluated in clusters, and the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Experimental and Clinical Traumatology also looked into which of these questions have already been answered by research, and which of these questions have not. And then they decided to pick up on a group of questions that investigates the relationships between aging and the healing of wounds. And in 2022, they founded and they received 4 million euros of funding from the Austrian National Foundation for Research, Technology and Development to follow up on the outcomes of this crowd science approach in early stages of the research process. If we move on to looking into the benefits of applying such approach, this is research I did together with a couple of my colleagues, where we looked into data from projects that crowdsourced research questions. And the project I've shown you before was one of the projects from which we collected data. And we asked ourselves, what is the nature and quality of research questions generated by crowds, and how does the quality of research questions generated by crowds of patients, caregivers, and professionals, medical professionals, compare to research questions developed by professional scientists? And the main findings of this study are that most of the crowd-generated research questions are problem restatements that cannot be used as research, as an input to research projects. But those inputs, or those submissions that actually were research questions, they tend to be more interdisciplinary, often combining concepts across fields of medicine or integrating ideas from outside of medicine. On average, these crowd-generated questions have a lower novelty, a lower scientific impact, but they are similarly relevant, practically relevant than professional scientists' research questions. But, and that's the surprising and interesting finding of that study, once we select the best research questions from the crowd within or across individuals, these questions then outperform professional scientist research questions on all dimensions: novelty, scientific impact, and practical impact. So under certain conditions, it pays off to engage, for example, with patients, caregivers, and medical professionals in developing research questions. Let's move on to using open innovation science, in this case, again, a crowd science approach in later stages of the research process for collecting data. Foldit is a very well-known and prominent example of gamified crowd science for protein folding. So via the Foldit platform, anyone basically can play games and unfold proteins as part of this game, and by doing so, collect data, contribute to training artificial intelligence, solve problems with respect to protein folding. And this data is then used in research on Alzheimer's or HIV, for example. And it also generates highly valuable inputs to top-level publications. And I selected here 2 publications, one in PNAS on protein sequence design, or one in Nature on the design of protein binding proteins from target structure alone. And an interesting feature of this approach is that the Foldit crowd, the Foldit community has been mentioned as one of 11 co-authors on this publication. So the way the crowd is credited for having provided inputs to this scientific paper was as being named as the Foldit players as one of the co-authors. All right, and last, before finishing up, a long answer to Benedict's first question, I would like to show you an example of an open innovation science example, again, a crowd science approach for late stages of the research process, for the diffusion of research using crowdsourcing for science communication in space research. So that's a project that was launched by NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab at the California Institute of Technology. And this project invites the general public to access all their science data and all the results of their various space missions, and to transform these data, these results, into infographics that make scientific concepts and scientific results from space research more accessible to the broader public. So here, external knowledge is used to translate scientific outcomes into accessible information for the purpose of science communication. All right, let me stop here and move on and get back to Benedict.
Yeah, so Marion, thanks a lot for this very comprehensive overview and the many relevant examples you gave us from a lot of scientific disciplines, also including quite a few nice examples from the neurosciences. At the very beginning, you also mentioned the winner of the last ECN Open Innovation Award, which is currently a quite active and thriving project supported by us, of course, and we are very excited about it and can't wait for the results. But apart from that, could you share other examples of open innovation in science projects that have been developed as part of the Lab for Open Innovation in Science here locally at the ECN?
Sure. By the way, it's always a pleasure to work with the group of scientists in the Lab for Open Innovation in Science, and I think we really have developed some super interesting projects, and I prepared a couple of slides on that too, to give some more examples. And here we have another example, an Open Innovation in Science Award winner from last year. This is also a young researcher. She joined us digitally because she was currently spending a research stay in the US. She presented her project also at the Open Innovation in Science Award ceremony in Berlin last October. And her Open Innovation Science project is embedded in an MRI research on the effects of early life stress. So stress that babies experience during the pregnancy of the mother, and the effects on brain development. And in this particular project, she wanted to, or she plans on applying a crowd science approach to increase the speed and the accuracy of the quality control process for the brain segmentation. So in her project, one of the issues for implementing her research is that that brain segmentation, the quality control for the brain segmentation using neuroimages is very lengthy, so it takes a lot of time, and it's important that this is a very accurate approach. And in order to speed up the process of doing this quality control and increase the accuracy of the quality control process for the brain segmentation, she developed a process to basically create a crowd science interface and related training material, and to launch a crowd science approach on a large crowd science platform, Suniverse, and invite basically anyone, the general public, based on a specific training program and or training material that is provided, to help looking at neuroimaging data and processing the brain segmentation, or doing the quality control for the brain segmentation. So basically, the proposition here is that if many people, of course, guided by certain training material, will engage in this process, we will be able to significantly increase the speed of doing the quality control and also increase the accuracy of that. This was also a project that she actually won the first prize in the Open Innovation Science Award last year. And I think, yes, I have another example from a winner That was a team of two researchers of the Open Innovation and Science Award in 2019. Those two researchers were doing research on schizophrenia. So that was an open and collaborative approach that was embedded in their research on schizophrenia. Also, their research relies on fMRI imaging. And in this particular research, they aimed for using a co-creation approach. So co-creation workshops with researchers, TAs, medical engineers, and patients to develop solutions for improving the quality and the comparability of patient neuroimaging data. Because as I learned working with them back then, is that patients suffering from schizophrenia really have problems when undergoing fMRI scans. There is issues with respect to claustrophobia. There's issues with respect to being very sensitive to noise, for example, which compromises the quality of the brain scans. And the idea of that Open Innovation Science project back then was to, if we include the patients, their caretakers, medical engineers, and other stakeholder groups in developing a way to make patients suffering from schizophrenia feel more comfortable when undergoing a brain scan, then we may be able to improve the quality and comparability of our neuroimaging data. And as a nice side effect, we may also be able to reduce the duration of fMRI experiments that are conducted with patients. Yeah, I hope those two examples helped, Benedikt.
Yes, they did, in fact. So just briefly, because some of you entered this, some of your participants entered the webinar a bit delayed, please, if you have questions, send them to me directly in the chat function. I'm currently sorting the questions we already have, so we have a Q&A at the end. And coming back to what Marion just had shown, so when you work like this, this will be a new way to work for many researchers, and we all know that new things take time to get used to and to be adapted to. What are the factors that influence whether or not open innovation in science approaches can or should be used in a scientific research project?
I mean, we know that like open science practice, like open access publication, open data sharing, open peer review, they have already been picked up by multiple research disciplines. In some areas, or with respect to some funding schemes, this is already a standard. So you have to, for example, publish your outcome open access. You have to do your data management plans and so on and so forth. But engaging with the outside world, collaborating with different kinds of stakeholders in the actual research process is definitely something that is not widely used in many different scientific disciplines. And if we look into some of the factors that are relevant to consider, then this definitely relates first and foremost to the question, what are the relevant challenges that I, as a researcher, that you as researchers face in your research, or with respect to a particular research project that you plan for or that you already work on. And as we have seen in the examples that I presented before, there might be different challenges that you face, such as finding a novel and societally relevant research question or hypotheses. Another challenge you may face is access to data, is data quality or data quantity, or do you have enough access to funding, to infrastructure or other resources? Is there an issue like in the project that I presented before, related to efficiency, speed, or accuracy in collecting, analyzing, or processing your data? Do you need to make sure that you avoid biases in interpreting your findings? Is the biggest issue that you face to overcome the translational gap, so to make sure that whatever you're working on in a basic research project gets translated into a clinical research project and eventually, for example, into a new therapy or into a new type of medicine. And I think what is important is to really think about, as a researcher, along the entire research process. And is subject to the research discipline you may be working in. Your process might look totally different than the one that I mapped here. It's important to ask yourself, can, and if yes, how can applying open and collaborative practices help me addressing these challenges? And by doing so, eventually improve my productivity or improve the societal impact of my research. So I think that goes back to the concept of open innovation science, that openness and collaboration are not ends in itself. They are means to achieving a certain goal, to facing a certain challenge, to addressing a certain issue that you're facing in your research. So I think that's the first most important thing that we also talk a lot about in the Lab for Open Innovation Science, to really consider how can open and collaborative practices help me to address challenges in my research and to improve the quality, the efficiency, the novelty, or the societal impact of my scientific research. The second aspect that I think is important when thinking about the factors that influence whether or not to use open innovation science practices and whether or not to succeed with doing so is that you have to think about who is the audience for your research and what do you or your audience expect from or find positive, negative about the current processes and outcomes of your research. So is the main audience scientific peers, or is it that you are thinking about writing a research proposal? Is your audience, your primary audience, a funding agency? Is it the users of your research? That could be patients if you do clinical research, or they could be other researchers, other more applied researchers if you are doing basic research. Is it the general public? Is it policymakers, or is it just yourself? Yeah. And then what are the goals that you want to pursue as a researcher? Is it about curiosity? Is it to find out new things? Is it about generating societal impact, improving the world with your research, making sure that your research translates into something that is generating impact in society? What about your career path? Are you aiming for, if you're a junior researcher, are you aiming for a career in academia or in industry? How important is peer recognition and career advancement for you at your stage of the career? Is it important for you to generate financial income from your research? How important is it for you to translate your scientific discoveries into innovation? And all these questions will help you think about, can, and if yes, how can open and collaborative practices to science help you with addressing the expectations that your different audience may have and in achieving your personal goals. And last, I think it's important to understand that, of course, whether or not engaging in open and collaborative practices in science is successful depends on various factors, on the level of you as individual researchers, on the level of your research project, your research team, your research group, on the level of your university, your specific research field, or society in general. Yeah? For example, in some fields of research, such as astronomy, for example, or digital humanities, it's perfectly state-of-the-art to engage in citizen or crowd science, or to reuse open data instead of collecting your own data. In other fields, for example, in mental health research, it's in psychiatry, it's perfectly established already to co-create research with patients with vulnerable groups. In other research, this is a total novelty, for example, and you need to take that into account. And it, of course, depends on whether you are a junior researcher or a more senior researcher, whether you have access to funding yourself, or whether you depend on the funding of someone else. And with respect to funding, it's also important to think about, if you want to generate funding, whether that is by a research proposal to the Horizon Europe call, or to the DFG, or to another research institution, research funding institution, or whether it is by engaging in crowdfunding science approach, the question is, of course, what do the funding agencies require? Are there, like in the Horizon Europe program, specific requirements that you need to fulfill with respect to applying open and collaborative practices in order to be able to have a chance to get your research proposal funded, or to increase the likelihood that your research proposal gets funded? On the level of the individual level and on the team and group level, it's particularly also important to think about, do I as a researcher, or do we as a research group have the capabilities? Do we know about how to design open and collaborative approaches to science in a productive way to achieve our goals? Yeah, and I think the Lab for Open Innovation Science that Benedikt and Oliver have initiated at the Einstein Center for Neurosciences is a great place to learn about the role and value of open and collaborative practices in science, to experiment with them and to develop your own open innovation science projects. And on the organizational level, on the level of your university, we also have done some research showing that the kind of support your organization provides you with, and the level of autonomy your organization enables you to make decisions with respect to whether or not to engage in these practices is an important issue, as is the way your performance is measured. I think we need to be aware that as researchers, we will, and this will not go away, we will be measured by the quality of the outcome of our research in terms of high impact publications. Yeah? But is there a way that we can use these practices to help us develop more novel, more impactful research in a more efficient way? So I think it's important to understand that there's various factors on different levels, individual level, the organizational level, but also the ecosystem level, that will support you in doing this, or that will make it more difficult for you to do that. And I think the Einstein Center for Neurosciences has created a great environment to support researchers in order to productively apply open and collaborative practices to science.
Okay, so thanks a lot for this very elaborate explanation of the question. And we are now entering the open Q&A phase. I got quite a few questions, and I tried, while Marion was talking, to sort them and arrange them. Some are interrelated, so I will paraphrase them in a combined way as to avoid repetition in case some of the audience feel the question hasn't been addressed appropriately. Let me know in the chat function or write us an email later. I mean, we'll of course continue the dialogue also after this webinar is over. And with that being said, let's start with the first question. With respect to the way to improve open innovation in science, I wonder if there is any effort or activism to reform how the publishing system works out at the moment. The current pricing model is tied to reduced openness, so example also tied also to third world countries. And in my opinion, wasted resources that could be rewired to actual research instead of astronomical prices for both for publishing and accessing scientific knowledge. Current strategies like a golden access, etc., seem more like a workaround to the problems rather than an actual proposition that addresses it. So I'm wondering, is this also in the scope of OES?
I'm sure, Benedikt, you have insight on that too, but let me give a try first. Thank you for that question. I think openly sharing data and research results, and you particularly asked about open access publishing, or respectively like publishing behind the paywalls as the opposite. I think this is definitely part of discussing about the role and value of openness in science, because only if we do have research results that are accessible to other scientists or innovating organizations, we can reuse data, we can reuse insights in order to develop new research projects on the basis of this, to enable replication or reproduction, to enable the generation of innovation. So that is an essential part, of course. And you're totally right. There is still a lot of journals that have a a paywall, or that lock their publications behind the paywall. But I think from my own experience, many journals, many publishers do currently work on new ways of considering how to make their scientific insights available to a larger audience, to an inquiring society. PLOS ONE, for example, has an open access policy. Of course, at the moment, the current model is that you usually pay open access fees as the scientists. In, for example, EU-funded projects, you can, however, include the open access publishing fees into your budget. So the funding, the grant pays for your open access publishing fees. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not yet the final answer to solving this problem, and I know that many journals are experimenting with different ways. But to my experience, there's no perfect way yet that we could use as a best practice example. Benedikt, any add-ons to that?
No,
particularly in
I
the
would say
neurosciences?
not very much. The situation is currently not fair and not nice, and I think everybody agrees on it. And we would have to work on that to change it. Yeah. Okay.
And let me add one more thing, Benedikt, to that. I think what is interesting about thinking, I mean, if you just think about, like, you do your research and you openly share, then you publish your paper open access for others to know about your research. Of course, that's one way of making your research available to a broader audience. But when you think about an open innovation science approach, you may benefit from engaging with relevant stakeholders and stakeholder groups already as co-researchers, as part of the research process. And by doing so, they already get access to the entire research process and also to the outcomes as collaborators in your research. Yeah, that's another way of thinking about how to share your results, how to co-produce results together with various societal actors.
Okay, so thanks for this this answer. I mean, I can just add, I think it's also a bit discipline dependent. I always hear more that physics and mathematicians, at least once they have a suitable position, I tend to publish their results more and more on their web pages. But I think maybe that is also because if it's very formula based, you don't need the peer review process that much, because people can do the calculations themselves and see if everything is correct when they're from the field. But I think this is a more complicated thing in the medical and biomedical sciences to do. So the next question, I see that more applied science can benefit from engaging with patients or other stakeholders. And I myself am a molecular biologist and molecular neuroscientist, mainly doing classical wet lab work. How and why can I benefit from open innovation in science?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and it goes a little bit back to what I already tried to address, the different types of research, basic research, user-inspired basic research, or applied research, do benefit from different approaches to openness and collaboration in science. It might very well be that collaborating with patients is not the right approach for you to address a particular challenge in your research. But as we've seen in a number of the projects before, there are issues with the efficiency, the speed, the accuracy of collecting or analyzing data that might also be relevant in your research. As you said, what was it, molecular neuroscientist, right? You may also benefit from, for example, engaging in a crowd science approach, like in the iWire project, like in the project related to better understanding the effect of stress on the brain development of infants. That might be the right approach for you. It might also be interesting for a basic researcher to think about a model such as the Odin model. The Odin model is a model that particularly facilitates the co-production of basic research among scientists, for example, molecular biologists, various kinds of companies, and other societal stakeholders. So I think it really it's really to understand that openness and collaboration should be means to help you in your research. And if engaging with patients is not the right means, then don't do it.
Okay, thanks. So now comes something which seems to be on a lot of people's minds. So I try to combine and paraphrase several questions because they all focus on the same thing. So it seems as if engaging in these open or collaborative ways of doing research and science takes an additional lot of time. So, and eventually, particularly for the young researchers, we need to publish as much as possible at this stage of our careers to have a foundation. How does this go together, or does this go together at all, is the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the question we get very often, right? and I think it's a very fair and very important question. And if we think about like open science as a practice of openly sharing data and methods and protocols and results, and I mean, I'm required to do that myself, doing data management plans and preparing your data appropriately for being shared is a lot of effort. Yeah. And in that case, others benefit from your effort, and that's important because it helps us advance scientific research and create relevant inputs for society. But if you think about openness and collaboration, as we do in the Lab for Open Innovation Science, as a means to help you in your research, yeah, then I think it's important to always think about, and just like saying it in a very blunt way, a cost-benefit analysis. Think about the additional effort that I have to put in order to engage with, for example, patients, or to set up a crowd science process, or to engage in a pre-competitive research collaboration with companies. The effort I have to invest into that, does that pay off? Yeah? Does it provide me with an outcome that is better? Do I, for example, in the Odin model, where researchers collaborate with companies and co-create basic research projects, they get access to resources, data, materials, all kinds of scientific equipment from the companies. They get access to relevant problems that could inspire research questions that are relevant or increase the relevance of your research, and eventually help you develop a better research project and publish it in a better journal, and getting more citations, and maybe even getting the possibility of translating your research into innovation. So it's really it's going to be an additional effort compared to the way you work right now. But the question is, does the effort pay off? Or does the effort come in at a stage where it usually doesn't come in, and then it's easier at a later stage? Let's think about the example of using a crowd science approach to speed up or to improve the speed and the accuracy of doing of analyzing the infant's neuroimaging data. If what takes you, for example, half a year could be done by 1 week by means of engaging in a crowd science project, and even if you take a couple of days or weeks in order to develop that crowd science approach, may eventually pay off and may eventually help you improve the novelty, the efficiency, the speed, the accuracy, or the potential societal impact of your research. So the question to that answer is clearly, and I totally understand that, particularly for young researchers, you need to really make sure that whatever you engage in with respect to openness and collaboration benefits your research. And the cost-benefit analysis turns out in a positive way for you. Because in the end, and that won't change, I think, in the near future, we are going to be measured by the quality of our publications.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this answer. And just two small addendums to that. On the one hand, I mean, of course, it is our job as the Einstein Center, and has been in the past couple of years, to smoothen this transition, to reduce this investment, this costs, if you want, as much as possible. And on the other hand, Also, we have the very accurate example of a PhD thesis, which actually ran into a roadblock during the COVID times because not enough participants could be recruited for a study. And that particular thesis was, in fact, saved by the application of open innovation methods learned in this class, because it allowed the young researcher to completely reorganize the whole thesis project and conclude it very successfully. So I don't want to go into detail, we're quite over time yet, but we can give you, in case you're interested, we can also get you probably in contact, so you can learn more about that. Okay, so a very related question of the pragmatical aspects of open innovation, in a way, really, an extension of the first question. How do you think funding organizations or journals value if one uses open innovation in science practices?
I think here we really see a shift, and I brought the example already of the Horizon Europe funding program. Quite a lot of funding programs are now including requirements with respect to openness and collaboration as part of their evaluation criteria for funding proposals. So I think it's more and more important that researchers who want to obtain funding are capable of demonstrating capabilities of openness and collaboration, or of open and collaborative science practices. So this is obvious, not only related to EU funding, but also in various national funding programs all across Europe and the US. So that is one aspect. And I think that could be a good kind of nudge to think about engaging in open and collaborative science, because it could be an advantage when you are capable of convincingly showing how to apply that. It could be an advantage with respect to receiving funding. You also asked about journals, right, Benedict? So also here, I think we see a lot of changes. Different kinds of journals in different fields now not only require you to share the data, to provide a link, for example, to your data in a particular data repository, but there are also journals that take into account whether or not you applied open and collaborative practices to produce your research in the review system. The British Medical Journal, for example, already several years ago introduced a public and patient review process. So when you send a paper to the BMJ, it's not only reviewed by peers, it's also going to be reviewed by patient and public reviewers in order to assess the quality and particularly also the relevance of your research. So journals and funding organizations do address or increasingly address and require you to demonstrate your capabilities of embracing open and collaborative science practices. And a last note on funding, and even if we know that this is for small amounts of funding, but this is particularly important for junior researchers, it's became really quite a good way of accessing small amounts of money, for example, to fund a pilot study, or to fund a research trip, or to get access to a certain piece of data by means of engaging in a crowdfunding science project. Experiment.com, for example, is a crowdfunding science platform where scientists can pitch, in a sense, or present a particular research project and inform what kind of resources they would need in order to realize a particular aspect of that research project, and then invite the general public to donate small amounts of money in order to achieve a certain pledge. For example, you ask for 10,000 euros in order to implement a particular pilot study to decide whether to go for this approach or to go for this approach in your research.
Okay, thanks. So then is a question which goes more to me and also to Oliver, maybe, than to Marion. So you have repeatedly mentioned highly cited impact and high impact publications related to open innovation in science. And can you give some examples of high impact papers that PhD students in Berlin have published with OES and perhaps resulting from the OES award. So we don't do this for so long. It's an excellent question, actually. I know that manuscripts have been submitted. I'm not 100% sure, and I didn't have time to check online if they already have been accepted. But we will, distribute this knowledge. We do the research on that, whether things have already been published. I all know a paper can take up to 2-3 years until it's eventually out. And when they are either on a preprint server or on a regular journal, we link them on our homepage, so you get examples of locally successful research publications. If not, Oliver accidentally knows that something has been just now accepted. No, okay.
But I think, Benedict, if I may add to that, we've only started doing this in 2019. Yeah. So most of these projects that we developed in the Lab for Open Innovation Science are still ongoing research projects. So in that sense, it's highly unlikely that that publications are already out on that.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that the publication can take 1 to 2 years until it's finally accepted. I know from some project that they do have submitted, but I haven't followed up on the state of acceptance yet. And until it's public, it also takes some time until it appears in PubMed. If the students don't tell us directly, we've been accepted, let's say. Sometimes do and sometimes not. A related question also about resources and the use of open innovation is the crowdfunding process in science projects really an alternative to regular science funding as offered by the big funding organizations and foundations?
No, it's not an alternative. It's an add-on, I would say. As I mentioned before, an analysis of the amount of money that researchers could crowdsource for their research projects on experiment.com, one of the largest crowdfunding science platforms, was less than $10,000. So this is a platform that can be used to crowdsource smaller amounts of money, as I said, for pilot studies, for funding research trips, for funding certain data collection activities, for accessing certain kinds of data. There are exceptions, There's one project, for example, on experiment.com that achieved more than $2 million of funding. It was a research project on Batten disease, but that was an outlier. So on average, it's less than 10,000 euros. So it's a complementary way of getting access to funding, but that is particularly attractive to junior researchers, because usually junior researchers cannot apply for a big grant. They might participate in a grant application, but they usually don't apply for big amounts of funding themselves.
Okay, so and another section of the another question from this section I call the pragmatic aspects of open innovation. So you talk about openness in science, but it was also several times mentioned that scientists collaborate with companies. So how do patents and other ways of protecting knowledge and intellectual property fit into that concept?
I think that's a very important question, because this is where open innovation science is different from open science, because sharing knowledge, sourcing knowledge, and collaborating with various kinds of actors does not necessarily mean that everything needs to be free. For example, in a process where a researcher, let's say a neuroscientist, has developed a new approach, a new treatment approach, and filed for a patent on that. And actually, many researchers at Charité do hold patents on their scientific discoveries. Of course, that patent could be the starting point for engaging in a collaboration with a company in order to translate that scientific discovery into innovation. And in this case, only the parties involved in this collaboration would be able to access and leverage that knowledge. So open does not necessarily always mean free. And in some cases, it might be a good idea to protect intellectual property in some form or the other. And in other cases, it might be a bad idea to do so. And we also see open science platforms such as Open Targets, which is also a platform that facilitates drug target development or drug target validation. This platform has different degrees of openness. There's the fully open layer where everything is accessible to anyone. Then there's a layer where knowledge and data is accessible only to the collaboration partners on this platform who engage on a project. And then there is a level where when it comes to translating science into innovation, where only partners who signed a contractual agreement have access to the kind of knowledge. So intellectual property protection in some cases may actually facilitate or spark collaborations, and in other cases it might be the totally wrong approach. So I think it's important to also understand what intellectual property means, both for sharing it or selling it, but also for sourcing it or acquiring it. There are crowd science projects where scientists, instead of spending years to develop complicated algorithms themselves, crowdsource these algorithms on crowdsourcing platforms such as Kaggle, crowdsourcing platform for data scientists, or Topcoder. And then the best solution is rewarded by a monetary price. But again, that monetary price might be a lot less than spending years on developing the algorithm yourself. And again, there's different ways of sharing and collaborating, either in a more or less protected, intellectually protected way. And I think it's important to know that, which is also why in the Lab for Open Innovation Science, we do have sessions as part of which we talk about how do you, if it's needed, how do you negotiate a contractual arrangement with a collaboration partner with respect to foreground IP and background IP and so on and so forth.
And then we have here a related question. Since we have handed out the award for the first time in 2019, and of course then we had a break due to COVID. But nevertheless, the question is rather interesting, also in terms for a center like the Einstein Center. So when you start a typical OES initiative like this, our open innovation training for PhD student, how long does it, in your experience, take to lead to advances in research outcomes?
That's a very good question and a difficult one to answer, because transforming an ecosystem, whether that's in a university department, a research group, changing the way you work, changing your usual habits of doing research, of course, this takes time. Yeah, and I think we've also seen that. Benedikt, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we've started the first Lab for Open Innovation Science in the fall of 2018, and over the year, significant improve with respect to, on the one hand side, understanding the value of all that, but also applying it in your own research, and engaging also with the respective labs or departments or research groups. For example, the PhD students were embedded in. We have last year seen quite a lot of applications to the award where the PhD students co-submitted their open innovation science proposals together with their PIs, together with their research group leaders. So I think it will take time because a systemic transformation always takes time. And going back to the open innovation science model, we have the individual level, we have the team level, we have the department level, the university level, and the ecosystem level. And there's a lot of transformation that is necessary to change the way we do science, but it takes interventions. And I think, Benedikt, what you started here is such an intervention. And over the process of 4 to 5 years, I think we have made a significant improvement here.
Yeah, so I mean, I can just add to this. I mean, when we started this PhD education, we were, to my knowledge, one of the first, maybe even the first, to do this on a level of such an early career researchers, and that meant that the first 1 or 2 editions also greatly needed to be revisited and adapted to the audience, which we were catering to. The pandemic years didn't help because interactions are important. I do personally hope that we will see measurable results in terms of publications really within the next in the next year. I know that, as I said, I know that some manuscripts have been handed in. I know that the last year winning project is extremely active and they are doing patient recruitment and other things because we are supporting that. On an average, I mean, it's hard to get any scientifically reliable data if you're one of the first. Maybe in 10 years, people will sit together and look for all open innovation initiatives and draw a timeline and say, on average, in the humanities, in the biomedical science, this takes so and so long. But currently, this is hard to evaluate. But I expect really hard measurable results relatively soon in terms of publications and grants and things like that.
Benedikt, if I can add one more sentence to that. So first of all, I think many more universities are now incorporating or have already set up initiatives like this one, because it is also one of the key skills in obtaining research funding. But I think we also need different ways of measure the impact of doing this. Of course, and as I also tried to discuss, it should eventually translate into better research outcomes, more novel, more impactful outcomes. That's the overall goal. But as, for example, open innovation in science platforms such as the ODIN platform at Aarhus University, they have just completed their midterm evaluation, and they purposefully not only, how can you measure citation statistics or impact, journal impact factors if you're in the middle of doing something. So they also measured the success of this with respect to new forms of collaboration. So scientists, what are new stakeholders that scientists engage in? What are new kinds of learnings in the process? So there are different ways of also evaluating the impact. And I think that will also be important in evaluating any kind of open innovation science initiative.
Yeah. I mean, and just maybe this is a concluding remark to this, but it's maybe homework for us from the Einstein Center to do. Of course, we don't see the impact is not popping up on our screens automatically. Like when somebody gets our education and writes a grant with an open innovation part and gets the money granted, this is not automatically coming to our knowledge unless the people tell us so. So since I think this question is pivotal and important, this is something we should think about surveying in the next couple of months. So we ask our PIs, ask our PhD students if they have incorporated anything, if they have used it in a grant application, etc., etc., and maybe get a feeling of the state of what we've been teaching them, because we're mainly a training unit. We find it very hard to track the results of our training if we don't get the feedback consistently, and this sometimes needs reminding. But yeah, we should definitely do that.
And I think we are reaching the end of the seminar. Yeah. Any last question?
I have one which I put at the very end because I think it's a nice one. We get it sometimes also in the talks, and it's not so pragmatic, but more a bit of a moral question related to open innovation in science, because it's about using citizens, among other things. So applying citizen science approaches basically boils down to using a lot of free available labor. To me, that doesn't sound fair. Why should citizens engage in such projects?
That's a question that I get a lot too. So thanks for that question. And I think here it's important to understand whenever you design a crowd or citizen science project, and we also practice that in the Lab for Open Innovation Science, it's really important to think about what motivates crowds to contribute to their time, their resources to your specific project. Yeah? And it's important to address that and make it a fair deal. And we know from research on citizen science that, for example, many of these large-scale image classification projects run on Suniverse, here people really like working on that because they really enjoy contributing to scientific research. If it's a gamified project, it's just enjoying playing a game. But in other projects, it's a totally different motivation. If patients suffering from particular diseases are enabled to co-create research questions, co-develop methods. This is a way of empowering them, and this is a way for them to be able to shape the direction of research and eventually contributing to developing solutions for themselves or for their loved ones. So I think understanding the motivations of crowd contributors and designing a project in such a way that it is a fair deal is essential for the success of such a project.
Okay, so I think this is a nice a concluding remark. And with that being said, I would say thanks everybody who participated. It's a complicated topic. In case you have further questions, drop us a mail and we'll answer them if they come up later on. Thanks particularly to Marion, who could make it despite a COVID infection to come back again in such a short notice. And yeah, I wish all of the participants, I hope they had fun, and I wish all of you a great start into the week.
Thank you very much. Have a great remaining day.
Bye-bye.